Hey friend, please subscribe. 1 second for you. Big deal for me. That night, amid a torrential downpour, I found my grandmother huddled at a bus stop, soaked, trembling, her clouded eyes darting around like a lost child. She had been thrown out of my own apartment by the woman I once called my fiancée. When I returned home, the door swung open and I froze. Kelly stood there, her hair disheveled, and behind her was Jake, my best friend, the one who swore he'd stand at our wedding. They looked at me without a trace of remorse. It turned out that while I was working late nights to care for my grandmother, they had betrayed me and cast her out onto the street like an old, discarded thing. I thought that was the lowest point of my life until a stranger appeared in the hospital corridor. A man with silver hair, calm eyes, and a trembling voice as he called her name. Grace, it's been so long. I never expected that this man would be a millionaire, and that the past he shared with my grandmother would change my life forever. Hello, my name is Ethan Walker. I'm 27 years old, raised in the towering shadow of the Walker family, a lineage once renowned in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where steel furnaces burn day and night like the heartbeat of the Rust Belt. I work at the Riverside Industrial Complex as a metal material sales specialist, dealing daily with numbers, contracts, and the stifling heat of machine shops. The job isn't glamorous, but I take pride in knowing I'm helping keep the wheels of industry turning. Yet deep down, I know I'm running from something. Perhaps the Walker name, or more precisely what it once stood for. Pittsburgh isn't a city of grand dreams. It's gritty, filled with smoke dust and cracked concrete roads. But to me, it's home. It's the sweltering summer afternoons on the porch of the Squirrel Hill mansion where my grandmother Grace sat telling stories, her voice soft as the piano notes she used to play. She was the only one in the family who made me feel I belonged here. My parents, Stephen and Diane Walker, were different. They were consumed by lavish parties, handshakes with high society, and a lifestyle I never truly understood. For me, I craved the quiet moments with Grandma when the sunset painted the oak trees red and the breeze carried the faint scent of dry grass. Grandma Grace, a 76-year-old woman with silver hair and gentle blue eyes, was once a piano teacher. She loved music, loved melodies that told stories words couldn't touch. But now she was slowly being pulled into the fog of Alzheimer's. Some days she forgot my name, forgot the songs that once made her smile. Yet every time I looked at her, I still saw the spark of the strong woman who had been my only anchor in a cold childhood. She was the only one who could soften my grandfather. Arthur Walker. A man Pittsburgh revered, but to me a symbol of discipline and pressure. My grandfather, Arthur Walker, 80, was the founder of Walker Steel and Foundry, a steel company that dominated the Rust Belt industry from the 1970s to the 1990s. He was a legend. At least that's what the newspapers called him. To me, he was a man who lived by principles so rigid I sometimes wondered if he was ever truly happy. He ran the family like he ran his company. Everything had to be in order. No one allowed to step out of line. But with Grandma, he was different. I once saw him look at her with a rare tenderness, as if she was the only thing reminding him he was human. My father, Stephen Walker, was another story. At 54, he lived off the glow of his father's legacy without ever really trying. He worked in real estate in Cleveland, but his projects often failed due to impatience and lack of vision. To him, the Walker name was just something to flaunt at wine-soaked galas, where he toasted with people who didn't care who he was. My mother, Diane, 50, wasn't much different. She loved expensive dresses, European vacations, and the thrill of being admired. But at home, she was often silent, letting my father make all the decisions, as if she'd grown accustomed to being a backdrop to his ambitions. I was different. I didn't want to live in the family's shadow. I wanted to build something of my own, however small. Maybe that's why I fell for Kelly Adams, the 25-year-old marketing specialist at my company. Kelly was a breath of fresh air in my life, vibrant, intelligent, with a smile that could melt even the worst days. We met during a team meeting when she stood up to present an idea with a confidence I'd never seen. Within months, we were in love, and soon after, I asked her to move into a small apartment with me in downtown Pittsburgh. The place wasn't luxurious, but to us it was a home, a sanctuary where I could briefly escape the weight of the Walker name. But that sanctuary, I soon realized, couldn't hide the cracks lurking in my family. Things began to shift when I was 23. As my grandfather's health started to decline, he was in and out of hospitals, and each time I visited, he spoke only of the company of legacy as if it was his final breath. "Ethan," he once said, his voice raspy, "you have to protect what I built. Don't let it fall into unworthy hands." I nodded, but I was confused. I didn't know what he wanted from me when my father Stephen was the one he'd chosen to take over. Then one day in the Squirrel Hill mansion, the family lawyer Mark Turner called a meeting. I still remember the stifling air in the grand living room with antique paintings on the walls and light from the crystal chandelier gleaming like a reminder of the family's wealth. Mark Turner, in a gray suit and gold-rimmed glasses, opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. It was the draft of my grandfather's new will. His voice was steady, but each word struck me like a hammer. "All assets, shares, and control of Walker Steel and Foundry will pass to Stephen Walker." Mark read his eyes, scanning the room. My father sat up straight, a triumphant smile spreading across his face, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. My mother nodded approvingly, her fingers brushing the pearl necklace around her neck. Grandma, seated beside me, remained silent, her trembling hands resting on her lap. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew my father wasn't the right person. He lacked the vision, the dedication my grandfather had poured into building the company, but I said nothing. I was just a 23-year-old kid. What did I know about running a steel empire? A few weeks after that meeting, my grandfather, Arthur Walker, passed away, a sudden heart attack right in the company office where he'd spent nearly his entire life. I still remember the day I got the news. I was at Riverside inspecting a steel shipment when my phone buzzed. My mother's voice on the other end was choked, but not with grief. "Your grandfather's gone, Ethan. Come home now." I rushed to the Squirrel Hill mansion where it seemed the whole city had gathered to bid him farewell. The funeral was grand, with eulogies hailing him as the legend of Rust Belt Steel. Newspapers wrote of him as a hero, but to me, he was the man who left a void nothing could fill. Standing before his coffin, I didn't cry. I just looked at his face, now more peaceful than ever, and wondered if he knew his legacy was teetering on the edge of collapse. Grandma stood beside me, gripping my hand tightly, but her eyes were lost as if she'd lost a piece of her soul. I knew she wasn't just grieving his death, but what was coming for our family. After the funeral, my father officially took over Walker Steel and Foundry. The family, the city, everyone expected him to carry on the Walker name with pride. But I saw the first signs of the storm brewing. I went back to my job, to Kelly, to our little apartment. I tried to believe everything would be okay, that my father would find a way to uphold my grandfather's legacy. But deep down, I knew an era had ended. The shadow of Walker Steel and Foundry, the shadow of my family, was fading. And though I didn't want to admit it, I felt an ominous premonition that the chain of tragedies for the Walker family had only just begun. 3 years have passed since my grandfather's death. 3 years long enough for me to watch everything crumble like a sand castle before the tide. My father, Stephen Walker, stepped into the role of head of Walker Steel and Foundry with the confidence of a proud heir. But he lacked the cool head or warm heart of my grandfather. I still remember those early days when he showed up at the company in an expensive suit, shaking hands with executives, laughing as if he were ready to conquer the world. But behind that smile, I saw emptiness. He didn't understand. The numbers in the financial reports didn't care about the roar of the steel furnaces, and paid even less attention to the workers who had dedicated their lives to my grandfather's legacy. I continued going to Riverside every day, working with steel shipments, negotiating with clients, and trying to keep myself busy. But each time I looked through the office window at the factory smokestacks billowing clouds of smoke, I couldn't help but wonder, is everything my grandfather built slowly vanishing? I overheard colleagues' conversations, whispers about the company losing contracts, about competitors overtaking us. Walker Steel and Foundry, once a symbol of Rust Belt strength, was now a hollow shell run by a man who didn't know what he was doing. My father began making decisions that even I, a low-level sales specialist, could see were mistakes. He wanted to expand into real estate, a field he'd already failed at miserably in Cleveland. He talked about renewable energy projects, wind farms he knew nothing about. I tried to talk to him once on a rare evening when he returned to the Squirrel Hill mansion without being drunk. "Dad, we should focus on steel," I said, my voice trembling with fear of his anger. "It's what we know, what we're good at." But he just looked at me, his eyes bloodshot from liquor, and smirked. "Don't tell me how to do my job." My mother Diane was no help. She nodded along to every decision my father made as if she'd grown accustomed to being his shadow. I had hoped she might rein him in, but she cared only about her Paris trips, designer handbags, and the galas where she could flaunt the Walker name. I looked at them, and my heart grew heavy. In the midst of this, Kelly was my only solace in our small apartment. She always knew how to make me laugh, whether with a funny story about her workday or a simple dinner of homemade spaghetti. But even Kelly began to notice the unease in my eyes. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked one night as I sat staring out the window at Pittsburgh's twinkling streets. I nodded, but inside I knew I wasn't okay. Then one day, the news hit like a knife. Walker Steel and Foundry was sold under pressure from shareholders and banks. My father had agreed to transfer the entire company, the legacy my grandfather had spent his life building. I heard it from a colleague, not my father. "Ethan, you didn't know?" he asked, his eyes full of pity. "Your family's company. It's gone." I stood frozen, gripping my phone, feeling the ground collapse beneath me. I called my father, but he didn't answer. I called my mother, and she said, her voice cold. "It was the only way, Ethan. You wouldn't understand." I drove to the Squirrel Hill mansion where my parents were staying. The house was still grand, but its warmth was dead. Only a cold beauty remained like a tomb. My father sat in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, while my mother stood by the window looking out as if to avoid my gaze. "How could you sell it?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger and pain. It was Grandpa's life's work, a whole generation's effort. My father looked at me, his eyes weary. "Ethan, the world has changed. Steel isn't everything anymore." I had to do something to save this family. But I knew he wasn't saving the family. He was saving himself and the lavish lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to. After the sale, my parents quit working. They lived off the money from the deal, traveling endlessly, shopping incessantly. I looked at them, and for the first time felt like they were strangers. They were no longer the parents I once knew. They were people burning through the family's legacy for fleeting moments of extravagance. But the worst was yet to come. 5 months later, as the money from the sale began to dwindle, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was gentle, but each word cut like a knife. "Ethan, we've sold the Squirrel Hill mansion," she said, as if it were just another transaction. "Your grandmother, we're putting her in a nursing home. She's not lucid enough to live on her own anymore." I was stunned. The Squirrel Hill mansion wasn't just a house. It was my memories, my summer afternoons with Grandma, the place where I felt safest. And Grandma Grace, the woman who had loved me her whole life, taught me my first piano notes, told me stories of old Pittsburgh, was now seen as a burden. I gripped the phone, feeling my heart being crushed. "How could you do this?" I asked, my voice breaking. My mother was silent for a moment, then said coldly, "Ethan, you don't understand. We need the money, and she needs professional care. But I knew that wasn't the reason. They didn't want to care for her. They didn't want the responsibility. They only wanted money and the freedom to continue their lavish lives. The anger inside me flared like a fire, but it was quickly extinguished by a deeper, more profound pain. I wasn't just furious at my parents for selling the Squirrel Hill mansion. I was devastated that they were ready to cast out my grandmother, the woman who had sacrificed her life for our family, into a nursing home like some discarded object. I sat in my small apartment feeling as though the world was collapsing around me. Kelly gently touched my hand, whispering, "Ethan, are you okay?" But I could only shake my head, unable to speak. How could I be okay when my family was tearing apart its own heart? I couldn't stay still. I had to do something. The next morning, I took a half-day off work and drove to Pittsburgh to the new house my parents had bought, a modern, lavish home in the upscale Fox Chapel neighborhood. As I stepped inside, the scent of expensive perfume and the soft hum of jazz music filled the air. My father, Stephen, sat in an armchair holding a glass of wine while my mother, Diane, flipped through a fashion magazine. They looked at me as if I were an uninvited guest. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" My father asked, his voice even but cold. I stood in the middle of the living room, hands clenched, trying to stay calm. "How could you sell the Squirrel Hill mansion?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. "How could you put Grandma in a nursing home? She's our family. What has she done to deserve this?" My mother looked up from her magazine, her eyes indifferent. "Ethan, you're blowing this out of proportion. That mansion was too big, too expensive to maintain, and a nursing home is the best option for her." Her words were gentle, but each one stabbed my heart like a knife. The best option for whom? For Grandma or for their freedom? My father stood setting his wine glass on the table, his eyes icy. "Don't lecture us on how to live, Ethan. We did what was necessary. The company's sold. The mansion's gone. Your grandmother will be better cared for there. What do you want? For us to keep that house and go bankrupt?" I couldn't believe his words. Bankrupt. They had just sold my grandfather's company, sold our family's legacy to fund their extravagant trips and lavish parties. Now here they stood in this opulent house telling me they had no choice. Blood rushed to my head and my voice came out louder than I intended. "All you think about is yourselves. You sold everything. The company, the house, and now Grandma. Do you know how much she sacrificed for this family? She took care of me when you were too busy partying. She taught me how to live, how to love, and now you want to throw her away like some old thing." My father stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Enough, Ethan. You have no right to talk to us like that. Who are you to criticize a low-life employee living in a cheap apartment with your girlfriend? What do you know about responsibility?" His words hit like a punch. I stood frozen, my breathing heavy. For a moment I wanted to scream to tell him he was the one who didn't understand responsibility. But I looked into his eyes and saw emptiness. A man who had lost everything, not because of circumstances, but because of his own selfishness. I turned to my mother, hoping she'd say something, anything, to salvage the moment. But she only looked down, avoiding my gaze. "I won't let Grandma go to a nursing home," I said, my voice low but resolute. "If you won't take care of her, I will. But I'll never forgive you for what you've done." My father scoffed, stepping closer. "Fine, handle it yourself, Ethan. From now on, you and your grandmother are on your own. Don't expect a cent from this family." His words were a final cut. I looked at him, then at my mother, and for the first time I realized they were no longer my family. They were strangers, trapped in their own greed and vanity. I turned and walked out of the house, not looking back. Outside, Pittsburgh was bathed in a fiery red sunset, as if the entire city were burning along with the anger in my heart. I drove straight to the Squirrel Hill mansion. When I arrived, my heart clenched. The house still stood proud but lonely with a sold sign staked in the front yard. Grandma was sitting in the living room next to the old piano, her frail hands gliding over the keys without making a sound. She looked up when she saw me, offering a faint smile. "Ethan, you're back," she asked, her voice weak. I knelt before her, taking her hands, feeling the fragility of the fingers that once taught me my first piano notes. "Grandma, I'm taking you home with me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I won't leave you here alone, and I won't let you go anywhere else. I'll take care of you." She looked at me, her eyes clouded by Alzheimer's, but I saw a spark flicker, as if she understood, even if just for a moment. I packed her belongings, her old dresses, a few family photos, and the small piano she loved. I knew I couldn't bring the piano to our apartment, but I couldn't let it be sold with the house. I called a friend from work, asking him to store it in a warehouse temporarily. Each item I touched felt like a piece of memory, from the music book she used to read to me to the scarf she knitted when I was a child. I packed them carefully, as if trying to hold on to what was left of my family. When we left Squirrel Hill, it was dark. Grandma sat beside me in the car, silent, her hands clasped tightly together. I looked at her, my heart heavy. I knew life in our small apartment with Kelly wouldn't be easy, especially with her condition. But I had no other choice. She was the only one who had never turned her back on me, and I would not turn my back on her. Our apartment sat on the third floor of an old building in downtown Pittsburgh, its white-painted walls yellowed with age and its windows overlooking a noisy street. It had never been spacious, but for Kelly and me it was once a home, a place where we built simple dreams of a shared future. Now, as I pushed open the door, carrying my grandmother's suitcase, the apartment suddenly felt more cramped than ever. Kelly stood at the entrance, offering a strange smile when she saw Grandma. "Hello, ma'am. I'm Kelly," she said, her voice gentle but laced with tension in her eyes. Grandma looked at her, gave a vague smile, then turned to me whispering, "Ethan, who's this?" My heart tightened. Her Alzheimer's was becoming more pronounced, each piece of her memory swept away by an invisible wind. I took her hand, guiding her to the living room corner where I'd set up a foldable bed. "This is Kelly, my girlfriend," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You'll stay here with us, okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were lost, as if searching for something in her fading memories. The first few days seemed manageable. I tried to make the apartment more comfortable for her. I bought an old armchair and placed it by the window so she could watch Pittsburgh streets where red buses rolled by and pedestrians hurried through the pale autumn light. She liked sitting there, her frail hands resting on her lap, sometimes murmuring piano melodies she once played. In those moments when sunlight streamed through the window and lit her face, I saw her as Grace Walker from years past, the woman who taught me love and patience. Kelly tried, too. She helped me prepare breakfast for Grandma, brewed tea, and sometimes sat to chat with her, though most of Grandma's responses were fragmented. "I know you love her, Ethan," Kelly said one night as we washed dishes in the cramped kitchen. "I'll do my best, but you know I've never taken care of anyone like this." I nodded, pulling her into a hug, her warmth a reminder that I wasn't alone. But deep down, I knew she was worried. And though I didn't want to admit it, so was I. Then the challenges began to surface like small cracks in a wall, spreading wider each day. Grandma's Alzheimer's wasn't just moments of forgetfulness. Some nights she woke up wandering the apartment, opening the front door as if searching for something. One night I jolted awake at 2 a.m. to find the door wide open and Grandma gone. I ran through the neighborhood, heart pounding, until I found her standing under a street lamp, her thin clothes no match for Pittsburgh's cold. "Ethan, where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I hugged her, tears welling, and guided her home. But when I saw Kelly's worried expression at the door, I knew things were getting harder. Kelly started to change. She left for work earlier, stayed at the office later, citing unfinished projects. I knew she was avoiding Grandma, avoiding the awkward moments when Grandma called her by a stranger's name or spilled coffee on the rug. Once Grandma tried cooking in the kitchen, but forgot to turn off the gas stove, filling the apartment with the acrid smell of smoke. Kelly came home to a chaotic kitchen and for the first time lost her composure. "Ethan and I can't keep living like this," she shouted, her voice breaking. "This apartment is suffocating, always smelling with her muttering and making everything a mess." "I'm not a nurse, Ethan." I stood frozen, unsure how to respond. I knew she was exhausted. So was I. I worked all day, came home to care for Grandma, cleaned up her spills, or sat with her through sleepless nights. But every time I looked into her eyes, I remembered those summer afternoons at Squirrel Hill when she told me stories of old Pittsburgh and of her dreams. She was the only one who never abandoned me, and I couldn't abandon her even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness. The tension between Kelly and me simmered. Our once laughter-filled dinners turned silent with only the clink of cutlery and Grandma's muttering from the next room. "Ethan, I love you," Kelly said one night, her voice soft but heavy. "But I don't know if I can keep doing this, taking care of her. It's too much for me." I took her hand, searching for the right words. "I know, Kelly. I know you're trying, but I can't leave her alone. She's all I have left." Kelly nodded, but tears fell before she could turn away. I wanted to hug her to say everything would be okay. But deep down I knew I was at a crossroads. Our small apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cramped cage, trapping the three of us, me, Kelly, and Grandma, in unspoken tensions. The weeks that followed were a struggle to balance everything. I went to work at the Riverside Industrial Complex, negotiating with clients, inspecting steel shipments, then rushed home to care for my grandmother. I learned to change her bandages, brew tea the way she liked, and patiently listened to her repetitive stories, even though she no longer remembered how many times she'd told them. But each time I looked into her clouded eyes, I saw a part of myself. The part I couldn't abandon, even if it meant the growing rift between me and Kelly. Kelly grew more distant. When she was home, she was quieter, her eyes avoiding mine as if she feared facing reality. I tried not to blame her. I knew caring for someone with Alzheimer's wasn't easy, especially for someone young like her who had dreamed of travel, carefree evenings, and a life unburdened by responsibility. But each time she left without a word, I felt a void widening in my heart. Then, one night, everything shattered. It was a frigid Pittsburgh night with rain pouring down as if to wash the city away. I had just finished a late shift, my coat soaked as I climbed into my car to head home. My mind was exhausted, heavy with work reports and worries about Grandma. The car stopped at a corner in Squirrel Hill where I used to spend summer days with her. I glanced out the window and then, like a blow to the chest, I saw her Grandma Grace huddled under the bus stop. Shelter her thin clothes drenched her eyes, confused and lost in the dark. I shouted and leaped out of the car. Rain stung my face, icy cold, but I didn't care. "Grandma!" I called, my voice breaking with panic. She looked up, her face pale, her trembling hands clutching herself. "Ethan," she whispered, as if unsure whether I was real or a shadow from her memory. I knelt before her, draping my coat over her shoulders, fighting back tears. "What are you doing here? Why are you out in this weather?" She shook her head, her voice faint. Kelly said I should go out for some air." Her words pierced my heart like a knife. Kelly had let her go out alone in this rain, this cold. I helped her stand, holding her tightly, shielding her from the biting wind. But in my mind, questions and anger swirled like a storm. I brought her back to the apartment, each step heavy as lead. When we arrived, I froze to see the front door locked tight from the inside. In the hallway, our belongings, my old suitcases, Grandma's bags of clothes, were thrown out soaked under the rain. I pounded on the door, my voice with anger and desperation. Kelly opened the door. The door swung open and I went numb. Kelly stood there, her hair disheveled, her eyes cold. Behind her, Jake, my best friend, the one I trusted more than anyone, leaned against the doorframe in a posture too intimate for me to bear. My heart stopped. "How could you do this?" I asked, my voice choking. "How could you let her go out alone in the rain, in this cold?" Kelly looked at me devoid of remorse. "I couldn't take it anymore. Ethan," she said, her voice sharp and cold, "this apartment isn't a nursing home. I tried, but I can't live like this." I looked at her, then at Jake, my voice rasping. "You were my best friend. How could you betray me in the worst way possible?" Jake stayed silent, avoiding my gaze. Kelly turned away, giving a bitter laugh. "Don't act so surprised. Things between me and Jake started a long time ago. You were just too blind to see." The room fell into a suffocating silence. I stood there, unsure whether I was more hurt by Grandma being cast out or by the betrayal of the two people I considered family. I quietly gathered our belongings, each shirt, each of Grandma's items, like picking up the shattered pieces of my life. I helped her walk away from the apartment, not looking back. Behind us, the apartment's lights went out, as if closing a chapter of my life I thought would last forever. The rain kept falling icy cold, washing away everything. Love, friendship, trust. All that remained was me and Grandma, two lonely souls leaning on each other in the midst of Pittsburgh's storm. The rain stung my face bone-chillingly cold, but I felt nothing except an overwhelming emptiness. I dragged the soaked suitcase, one hand tightly holding my grandmother, who shivered under my thin coat. She said nothing, only clutched my hand, her frail fingers as cold as ice. I looked at her, her eyes clouded by Alzheimer's, and wondered if she understood what was happening. But even if she didn't remember, I knew I had to be strong for her and for myself. I didn't know where to take her. The apartment I shared with Kelly, the place I once called home, had shut its door on us. My parents, in their lavish Fox Chapel house, had disowned me. I had only a few hundred in my pocket, meager savings from my days at Riverside. Under the relentless rain, I guided her to an old motel on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, where a flickering neon sign read, "Cheap Rooms." The motel owner, an old man with silver hair and a raspy voice, glanced at us but asked no questions. $35 a night, he said, sliding a key across the counter. I nodded, trying to hide the desperation in my eyes. The room was tiny, with damp-stained walls and a creaky single bed. The air reeked of mold and stale cigarettes, forcing me to open the window despite the rain seeping in. I spread a thin blanket on the bed, helped Grandma sit down, and dried her hair with the only towel I could find. "Grandma, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me, offering a vague smile. "Ethan, you're back," she whispered. I nodded, swallowing tears, and hugged her tightly. But that night, she started coughing. Dry, hacking coughs that shook her frail frame. I wrapped another blanket around her, but she still shivered, her skin pale and feverish. I realized she'd been out in the rain too long in Pittsburgh's biting cold. I stayed up all night, sitting by her side, placing warm cloths on her forehead, feeding her spoonfuls of watery porridge cooked on the room's ancient electric stove. She ate little, her eyes closed, her breathing faint. "Grandma, you have to hold on," I whispered, gripping her hand. But inside I was terrified. Terrified that I didn't have the strength to keep her with me. The next morning her condition worsened. The coughs wouldn't stop, and she developed a high fever, slipping into delirium. In a panic, I called a taxi and rushed her to St. Mary's Hospital, not far from the motel. In the emergency room, a middle-aged doctor with stern eyes examined her thoroughly and said, "She has severe pneumonia. She needs to be admitted immediately." Minutes later, a hospital administrator approached, holding a stack of forms. She spoke gently, almost routinely. "You'll need to sign for her admission and make an initial payment for treatment. The estimated cost is quite high." I looked at the paperwork and my heart stopped. The amount was far beyond anything I had. tens of thousands of dollars for the days ahead. I sat in the hospital corridor on a cold plastic chair, my hands trembling as I dialed my father's number. I knew he'd disowned me, but I had no other choice. The phone rang, and then his voice came through, mixed with the noise of a party in the background. "Ethan." "What is it?" he asked, his tone as cold as if I were a stranger. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Grandma's in the hospital, Dad. She has severe pneumonia. I need help. I can't afford the medical bills." Silence, then his voice sharp as a blade. "We're done, Ethan. Don't come to me anymore." The call ended abruptly. I stared at the phone screen, my heart shattering. My parents, the people who promised to always be there, had turned their backs when I needed them most. I called my mother, hoping for a flicker of light, but she only said, "Ethan, you're on your own. We can't help." The final door had slammed shut. I had no other options. I took my grandfather's watch, the only heirloom left from my family, and my phone, and went to a pawn shop near the hospital. The shop owner, a man with a thick beard, looked at me with pity. "You sure about this?" he asked as I placed the watch on the counter. I nodded, though my heart ached. That watch, always on my grandfather's wrist, was a memory of him teaching me to tell time as a child. But now I had no choice. I took the meager cash from the pawn shop, just enough to cover part of the hospital bill, and returned to St. Mary's Hospital. The days that followed were a blur of darkness. I worked morning shifts at Riverside, rushed to the hospital in the afternoons to care for Grandma, and barely slept. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, recounting fragmented stories. She lay there, her breathing faint. But each time she opened her eyes and smiled at me, I felt a tiny spark of hope. But my job began to falter. I couldn't focus. Numbers and reports jumbled together. Calls with clients went unanswered. My manager, a harsh man named Brooks, took notice. "Walker, what are you doing?" he barked during a meeting. "You think this is a game?" I tried to explain, but he didn't want to hear it. I knew I was losing my footing. 6 days later, I went to the company to request a salary advance, hoping for extra money to cover the hospital bills. But Brooks was waiting in the office, a paper in hand. "You're fired, Walker," he said coldly. "Poor performance. Here's your last half-month's pay." He slid an envelope toward me and turned away as if I'd never existed. I walked out of the company eyes, red clutching the thin envelope. I sat on a bench outside St. Mary's, light rain falling. I had lost everything. My job, my love, my family, my pride. But when I looked through the hospital window and saw Grandma lying there, her eyes still holding a faint glimmer of trust, I knew I couldn't give up. She was still alive, and I still had her. That was the last thread keeping me upright in the darkest days of my life. The days that followed, I lived like a shadow, moving between the hospital and the run-down motel on Pittsburgh's outskirts. The damp room, with its musty smell and the hum of insects in the night, became my temporary refuge. I no longer had my phone or my grandfather's watch, only a few coins and a heavy heart. Each morning I went to the hospital with a container of cheap soup from a nearby diner, sitting by Grandma's bed, feeding her small spoonfuls, hoping she'd recover. Grandma, though frail, smiled every time she saw me. "Ethan, you're back," she asked, her voice trembling as if I'd just returned from a long trip. I nodded, swallowing tears, and held her hand tightly, trying to hide how broken I felt. 3 days later, Grandma Grace's condition improved after intensive treatment. The doctor allowed her to sit in a wheelchair in the hospital corridor for a few minutes each day to breathe fresh air and regain some mobility. I walked beside her, holding a bowl of warm soup, feeding her while chatting, trying to make her laugh. The hospital corridor was bright with sunlight. The creak of the wheelchair mingled with the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. At the end of the hall, an older man waited to be called for a routine checkup. He wore a simple gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his demeanor calm and seasoned. As we passed, he froze. His gaze locked on Grandma Grace's face, aged and frail, yet still carrying traces of the gentle woman she once was. He stood still for a few seconds, then called softly, his voice trembling. "Grace." I looked up, startled. "Do you know my grandmother?" The man smiled, but it was a shaky smile, as if stirring a long, dormant memory. "I do," he said slowly. "She was once the woman I thought I'd marry if fate hadn't taken us down different paths." He stepped closer, his eyes still fixed on Grandma, as if seeing a figure from the past. "I'm William Pierce," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I knew your grandmother a long time ago." Grandma looked at him, her eyes clouded by Alzheimer's, but I saw a spark flicker as if a fragment of memory was struggling to resurface. "William," she whispered, then shook her head, uncertain of what she'd just said. I invited him to sit still, wary. He explained that he and Grandma were close friends in their youth, back when Pittsburgh was still a small town before Walker Steel and Foundry became an empire. "Your grandmother was special," he said, his eyes tinged with sadness. "We loved each other, but life led us down different roads. I never forgot Grace." I listened, my heart tightening. I'd never heard Grandma speak of a first love, but the way he spoke convinced me it was true. After a while, he asked gently what happened to her. I hesitated, then gave a brief account. That she was being treated for pneumonia, that we were staying in a run-down motel on the outskirts because we had nowhere else to go. He didn't interrupt, only nodded slightly, but I saw his hand clench and his eyes grew deeper, as if holding back a wave of compassion. Then, in a calm but resolute voice, he offered to cover all of Grandma Grace's medical expenses. I started to refuse, but he waved me off. "Let me help. It's the right thing to do." After that meeting, I learned more about him. William Pierce, a successful mining magnate from Greensburg, a widower with no children, he had lived quietly for years. Behind his composed demeanor was a man who had endured great loss, perhaps why he so easily understood what Grandma and I were going through. In the days that followed, he visited occasionally. Each time he brought a small bouquet of flowers or snacks Grandma used to love. Whenever he appeared, Grandma Grace smiled gently, as if meeting a piece of her past that Alzheimer's hadn't fully erased. The more I observed him, the more I realized he wasn't acting out of pity. He carried a genuine affection that had endured through time. When Grandma was discharged, he offered to help us move out of the damp motel. "I have an empty apartment nearby," he said. "It's not big, but it's comfortable. Your grandmother will be much better off there." I hesitated for a long moment before agreeing, partly out of gratitude, partly because I truly had no other options. The apartment he arranged was in a quiet area near the Monongahela River with soft light and a small balcony overlooking magnolia trees. He covered the initial costs and even had an old piano placed in the living room. "I thought she'd like it," he said, his smile so kind it made me believe him. As time passed, William visited more frequently. At first it was to check on Grandma's health, then to share coffee and talk with me. Through our interactions, I saw his sincerity devoid of any ulterior motives. He listened to every word Grandma said, patiently holding her hand when her memory faltered. One afternoon, while Grandma napped, William and I sat on the balcony watching the sunset fall over Pittsburgh. He asked about my job and family. I hesitated for a moment, then told him about my parents selling the company, about the rainy night Grandma was cast out, and the days we struggled in a cheap motel room. He didn't speak while I told the story. When I finished, he sighed, his gaze fixed on the river, reflecting the sunset. "You've been through too much, Ethan," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Not everyone would sacrifice everything for family. You have something this world is forgetting: honesty and resilience." His words were like a warm breeze dispelling the fog in my heart. I sat silently, feeling lighter for the first time in months. A few days later, William visited again. Grandma was feeling better and sat playing the piano in the small living room. He stood quietly, listening for a moment, then turned to me, his voice low. Grace didn't deserve to be treated like that. And you, Ethan, you deserve a chance to start over. Then he made an offer that stunned me. I'll loan you $2,400,000 to start a business. I only want 25% of the shares as a way to walk alongside you. I stared at him, unable to believe my ears. $2,400,000, a sum beyond my wildest imagination. But more than the money, what moved me was the trust in his eyes, the trust I had lost in myself. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled, his gaze drifting to Grandma, who was softly tapping out an old piano melody. "For Grace," he said slowly, "for the love I once had for her. And because I see in you a man worth believing in," I broke down, unable to hold back tears. The months of pain, the sleepless nights, the times I thought I'd collapse, all seemed to dissolve in that moment. I took his hand, whispering thanks, though I knew no words could fully express my gratitude. He patted my shoulder, gentle but firm. "You'll make it, Ethan. I believe in you." With William's money, I decided to stay in Pittsburgh and start anew. I didn't want to run from the Walker name. I wanted to revive it in my own way. I founded Walker Metalworks, a company focused on metal materials and recycled steel technology, a field I'd spent my youth learning. Not the massive steel furnaces of my grandfather's era, but a small workshop where I could control every detail. From the quality of the steel to how I treated my employees, I wanted to build a new legacy not based on fame or power, but on honesty and kindness. Grandma's health gradually stabilized. Alzheimer's still stole pieces of her memory. But in the new apartment by the Monongahela River, she seemed happier. I cooked for her myself, simple soups or toasted bread she loved. Every afternoon I took her for walks along the riverbank where golden sunlight danced on the water, and she often smiled, sometimes calling me by my grandfather's name. "Arthur, it's nice out today," she'd say. And I'd just smile, holding her hand, not correcting her. Those moments, however simple, were the most precious things I had. Life became more peaceful, not because it was easy. I worked from dawn to dusk, negotiating with suppliers, learning to run a company from scratch. But whenever I grew tired, I looked at Grandma and remembered why I started. William visited often, bringing white daisies and stories of old Pittsburgh. He spoke of the nights he and Grandma danced under the moonlight of the dreams they once shared. I saw in him not just kindness, but a love that had never faded, despite time taking so much. When Walker Metalworks landed its first contracts, I felt a pride I'd never known. I had achieved something not to prove anything to anyone, but to keep a promise to myself. But I knew I couldn't move forward without closing the past. One evening, as a fiery sunset painted the Monongahela River, I sat down and wrote letters, one to my parents and one to Kelly. I didn't write for revenge or to boast. I wanted them to know I wouldn't forgive, not out of hatred, but because I'd learned that greed and selfishness were the true tragedy. "You chose your path," I wrote to my parents. "I don't blame you, but I won't forget. I hope one day you understand that family isn't something to sell." To Kelly I wrote briefly, "You were once my world, but I've learned love can't be built on betrayal. I wish you happiness, but not here, not with me." I sent the letters expecting no reply, but a few days later responses came. My parents called, their voices dripping with scorn. "Who do you think you are, Ethan?" my father shouted over the phone. "Just a kid showing off with a few bucks," my mother said. "You should be grateful for what we did for you." Kelly sent a short text. "You're still a failure, Ethan. You'll never escape your family's shadow." Those words should have hurt, but I only smiled. I realized I no longer needed their approval. I had grown not because I had money or a company, but because I'd learned to let go. I looked at Grandma sitting by the window humming a piano melody, and knew I'd found what mattered most, a home, however small, filled with love. 3 years have passed since I received the loan from William Pierce, and Pittsburgh has witnessed the resurgence of a name I thought had faded into oblivion. Walker. Walker Metalworks, starting as a small workshop with a handful of employees, has become one of the city's fastest-growing businesses. We don't just produce high-quality recycled steel. We've pioneered sustainable technology, minimizing environmental impact. Local media dubbed us the Steel Miracle of the Rust Belt, a title that makes me both proud and self-conscious. I didn't do this for acclaim. I did it for Grandma, for William, and for myself to prove that the Walker name could carry a new meaning not of power, but of kindness. One morning I got a call from a local TV station. They wanted to interview me to hear about my journey from nothing to today. I hesitated, unaccustomed to the spotlight, but William, who still visited regularly, encouraged me. "Ethan, you're not just telling your story," he said, his eyes bright. "You're inspiring others who are struggling to rise." So I agreed. In the studio, under blinding lights and camera lenses, I spoke of the dark days, the rainy night. Grandma was abandoned, the damp motel, the time I pawned my grandfather's watch to pay hospital bills. But I also spoke of hope, of William's kindness, and how Grandma, even if she no longer remembers me, remains the flame guiding me every day. When the show ended, the host took my hand and said, "You're proof that honesty and love can overcome anything." I smiled, but in my heart I thought only of Grandma sitting by the window in our small apartment, humming old melodies. While Walker Metalworks rose, my parents, Stephen and Diane, slid down a slope of decline. I heard from old acquaintances that they'd squandered the money from selling Grandma's house. Extravagant trips, all-night parties, designer goods, all swept away their wealth like a flood. They moved to a cramped rented apartment on Pittsburgh's outskirts where thin walls and blaring car horns filled the nights. I heard they sometimes mentioned me not with pride but with bitterness and belated regret. "Ethan abandoned us," I overheard my father tell an old friend, his voice full of blame. But I knew the truth. They had abandoned me, and more importantly, they had abandoned Grandma. Kelly fared no better. After leaving me, she moved in with Jake, my former best friend who betrayed me. But soon enough, Jake showed his true colors. He swindled her savings and vanished, leaving her alone in a cheap apartment in a rough part of Pittsburgh. I heard this from an old colleague who ran into her at a coffee shop. "She looked worn out," he said, his eyes full of pity. "She asked about you, Ethan, but didn't dare say much. I didn't feel joy at the news, only a vague sadness, as if Kelly had become a stranger, a shadow from a past I no longer recognized." A month later, while inspecting a steel shipment, the receptionist told me 2 people were waiting to see me. When I walked out, there were my parents. My father in a crumpled suit, his eyes weary. My mother with a haggard face, no trace of her designer dresses or pearl necklaces. "Ethan," my father said, his voice trembling. "We need to talk as a family." I led them into my office, closed the door, and listened. They spoke of their struggles, of losing their wealth of friends who turned their backs. "We are family, Ethan," my mother said, tears streaming down her face. "Can't you help us just a little? We need a chance to start over." I looked at them, the people who once meant everything to me, and felt a strange emptiness. I wasn't angry or hateful, but I no longer felt bound to them. "I've chosen my path," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You chose yours. I can't go back." 3 days later, Kelly appeared. She stood at my office door in a thin coat, her hair disheveled, her eyes full of regret. "Ethan," she said, her voice breaking, "I know I was wrong. I'm sorry. Give me a chance even just to work here by your side." I looked at her, the woman who was once my world, and realized I no longer felt anger. But I also no longer felt love. "Kelly," I replied calmly, "some doors once closed are meant to stay shut for both our peace. I don't hate you, but I can't reopen that door. I chose distance not out of spite, but because I'd learned that forgiveness doesn't mean going back. Forgiveness is letting go, freeing yourself. I returned to the apartment by the Monongahela River where Grandma had grown frailer than ever. Alzheimer's had stolen nearly all her memories. She no longer recognized me, but every morning as I sat beside her feeding her spoonfuls of soup, she smiled gently, her eyes hazy but warm. That smile, though it didn't carry my name, was the faint light left after years of storms. Sitting by the Monongahela River, I reflect on my journey. From the dark days in the damp motel to the mornings with Grandma when sunlight streamed through the window like a promise that everything would be okay. I want my story to be a reminder that no matter how harsh life gets, there's always light at the end of the road. The lessons I've learned didn't come from million-dollar contracts or glowing headlines, but from the scars life etched into my heart. I've come to understand that love and gratitude cannot be measured by money or fame. My parents chose wealth and status, and they lost everything. But Grandma, even if she no longer remembers me, taught me that caring for those who cared for you is a duty, not a burden. The nights I stayed up with her changing warm cloths, feeding her porridge, were the moments I felt closest to myself. Sometimes those closest to us hurt us the most, like my parents like Kelly, but what matters is not letting your heart become like theirs. I chose to keep mine soft no matter how cold the world outside grew. Each time I held Grandma's hand, feeling her frail, trembling fingers, I knew I'd done right. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I realized that when you lose everything, you see clearly what you truly possess: integrity and resilience. Honor doesn't come from the Walker name or my grandfather's legacy, but from how I faced adversity. From the rainy night dragging a suitcase through a storm. From the times I stood up after every fall. I nearly gave up. Thought I wasn't strong enough. But Grandma, with her vague smile, and William, with his unexpected faith, reminded me that no one can take my worth away unless I surrender it. Each step of this journey, from the damp motel to the office of Walker Metalworks, was a declaration that I stood tall. Even when the world turned its back, I learned that forgiveness isn't about reopening old doors, but closing them for your own peace. I don't hate my parents or Kelly, but I can't let them back into my life. The letters I wrote to them weren't for revenge, but to close a chapter to move forward without carrying resentment. Hatred keeps you trapped in the past. Letting go is the only way to step toward the future. When I watched my parents and Kelly leave carrying their bitter words, I didn't feel pain. I felt relief, as if I'd shed a burden I no longer needed to carry. I will forever be grateful to William Pierce. Sometimes kindness comes from strangers, not blood. He believed in me when I'd lost faith in myself, and that was the greatest gift. The $2, $400, or $1,000 he loaned me wasn't just money. It was a chance, a reminder that I could start over. I've learned to cherish every opportunity, no matter how small, because each one is a door to the future. William didn't just give me money, he gave me faith. Faith that kindness still exists, that people can rise from ashes. Each evening I look at Grandma sitting on the porch humming a piano melody she no longer remembers by name. I hold her hand, feeling the fragility of the fingers that taught me my first notes. "Grandma, I did it," I whisper, knowing she might not understand. "I made the Walker name something to be proud of." She doesn't answer, just smiles. And in her eyes I see the Pittsburgh of old where everything could still begin anew. If you're going through dark days, remember that the light isn't far. It's within you. I lost everything. But through Grandma and those who believed in me, I found myself again. That is the true legacy of the Walker family. Not steel, not money, but resilience and love. Each morning as I sit with Grandma watching the Monongahela River glimmer, I know I found a home. However small but complete, and for me that is... Let us know in the comments, or just write what this story made you feel. If you liked it, hit like and subscribe. It really helps us keep sharing stories like this. YouTube picked this for you. Tap it. Let's see if they guessed right.